doing well today? You enjoy the Michael Jackson music? Let me tell you something. I am a big fan of Michael Jackson's music, always have been. But I cannot think of a human being who was more tormented about who he was as a person and who God made him to be. I mean, he didn't like anything about who God made him to be, right? He didn't like the color of his skin or the nap of his hair or the shape of his chin or the shape of his nose. And he spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars altering his appearance. And here's the before and after. And I'm not making fun of him. I'm just showing you. I mean, he was a good-looking young guy. And this is what he did to himself because he just didn't think God had done it right in the first place. And I don't know, I guess it just proves that America is the only country in the world where you can be born a poor black boy and die a rich white woman, I guess. I don't know. I want to talk about this song, I'll Be There. And it was the first and the greatest hit of the Jackson 5. Came out in 1970. And not only was it their biggest hit that Michael, of course, sang, but it was on the top song for Motown Records for 10 years running until, Lionel Richie finally bumped it aside. And you might know that part of the story, but here's something you probably don't know about the song I'll Be There. That when it was written, it was based on Matthew 18:20. Where the scripture says, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. And it's sort of interesting to me how pop culture borrows inspiration from the scripture again and again, rarely giving credit where credit is due. But see, all real inspiration comes from the scripture. And so sometimes when there are those songs that, people think it's talking about a romance. It's not talking about a romance at all, unless we're talking about Jesus' love for us and the fact that he will always be there. And that's my simple truth today, that regardless of what situation you're in life, where you are, what you're doing, Jesus is always there. Psalm 139 says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? He said, if I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. And I just want you to think about something. If we could get a revelation, an epiphany of the fact that Jesus was always there at every moment of our life, wouldn't that revolutionize the way we live? I think it would. Let me give you a little example of this. A couple of weeks ago, I was with Kathy and we were in the mall shopping. Probably my favorite thing in the world to do, seriously. And so she's off in the women's section and I'm in the men's section and I'm poking around and I'm at the shirt rack and I'm always at the clearance rack, that's where I go. And I'm standing at the clearance rack and there's this man and he's got about a 3-year-old daughter with him. And I just can sort of see them and I'm looking at the shirts and, I feel sorry for these 3-year-olds. They go through their whole life looking at everybody's bum. And I mean, that's the height that they have to live their life at. And so anyway, she kind of lost track of her dad because he was around the other side of the rack. And she walked over beside me and saw a pair of jeans like he was wearing, only they were mine. And she grabbed a hold of my leg. And so there she was, this little 3-year-old clutching onto my pants thinking I was her father. Now I'm standing there. I mean, what do you do when you got a little 3-year-old that you don't even know clean? You don't kick him away like a cat. And so I'm standing there thinking, this is kind of an awkward moment for me. And so then I thought, well, I'll just sort of clear my throat and get her attention and she'll realize I'm not her father and wander off. So I went... She looks up and sees me and screams bloody murder. And she just starts screaming her head off. Now, I'm used to that sort of thing because I have that effect on women. So I wasn't really surprised, but she was in absolute shock. Within like 2 seconds, her dad is there and picked her up. And of course, immediately she stops crying. And her dad's holding her like this, and she is leering at me and giving me that evil eye like I'm some sort of perv. And of course, by this time, all these people in the whole place had heard this commotion, and I'm sort of standing there trying to look innocent and try to pretend I'm not some sort of pedophile. I mean, it was really super awkward moment for me that this 3-year-old imposed on me. But all of a sudden, I realized something. As long as she knew her father was there, she felt comforted and safe. As soon as she thought somebody else was there, she was in panic mode. And I thought if we could begin to understand that wherever we are, whatever we're doing, that Jesus is always within arm's reach from us, it would change and revolutionize our life. And that's what that song is all about. I'll be there. Call on me and I'll be there. I want to show you a verse today that I think is sort of interesting. It's from Isaiah 43. And this is what it says, verse 2. And I want you to listen carefully to how it's worded. It says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. Did you notice that it said when, not if? It didn't say if you go through the waters. It didn't say if you go through the fire. It said when you go through. And I think everybody in this room knows what this is talking about, that you will face your waters and you will face your fires, these two metaphors. And I just put it in this simple way. Sometimes you're over your head, and sometimes you're going through the fire, right? I think every one of you knows what it feels like to be over your head in something, right? You get into this situation that you thought you could handle, and the next thing you know, you're feeling over your head. You take on a job that you thought you were qualified for, and you realize you aren't, and you're over your head. You borrow some money, and the next thing you know, you're over your head in debt. You get yourself into a relationship, and you realize in this relationship, you're over your head. I know a bunch of you are saying, what are you talking about? I'm talking about marriage. What do you think I'm talking about? Every guy in this room knows what I'm talking about, because the moment you got married, you were over your head. The reason is because most of you married up. And so you have to spend the rest of your life convincing your wife that she didn't marry down. Which she did, right? Everybody, all these wives are looking at their husbands going, it's true. I did marry down. There's this great story about this gal, and her husband doesn't come home one night, so she rushes over to her neighbor, and she said, George didn't come home last night. And so the neighbor says, well, we got to go to the police station and issue a missing person. So they go down to the police station, and the officer says, so describe what your husband looks like. And she says, well, he's tall, dark, handsome, soft-spoken, and kind. The neighbor looks at her and says, what are you talking about? He's short, fat, bald, loud, and mean. She says, yeah, I know, but who'd want him back? You don't have to take that personally, guys. For goodness sake, a bunch of guys going, me? It's not a true story. Well, it is a true story, but. So here's what I want to do today. I want to talk about a story that probably many of you are familiar with, and it's a story in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or as I always love to call them, the three Jewish contractors, my shack, your shack, and a bungalow. And I love this story, and every Christian knows this story. Every Sunday school child knows this story, because it's one of the great stories of all time. We have Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He goes in, he attacks Israel, he sacks the city of Jerusalem, and he takes a bunch of these young men captive to Babylon, and three of these young men are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And right off the hop, they're over their head. I want you to think about it. They're over their head in the fact that they're in a foreign culture, in a foreign land, with a foreign people, with a foreign religion, and a foreign language. They are so over their head. But what's about to happen is they're about to go through the fire. And we need to look at that story, because there's a lot we can learn about this story of going through the fire. So this is how it works. So Nebuchadnezzar was having an especially good day and was so pleased with himself and his kingdom that he decided to build to himself a statue of himself 90 feet tall. And so he erects this statue to himself, and he calls it the Trump Tower. I don't know, wait a minute. That's that other guy. I always get those two guys mixed up. My apologies on that. And so he erects this tower. I don't know what he calls it. And he has his grand idea. He says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a great day today. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to play the music. We're going to play the horn and the lyre and the harp. And we're going to play all this music. And when you hear the music, the entire kingdom, what you do is you bow down and you worship my image. So the music plays, and everybody bows down, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I love this picture, if you look at this picture, because this is, imagine what it looks like. I mean, you imagine being in this situation where every single person bows down except you and your two buddies, and you stand up ramrod straight, realizing what you've got yourself into. And that's the picture. This picture, by the way, comes from the Children's Bible. People say, what version do you read, Pastor Mark? This is the one. Just so you're aware. I love the pictures that help us explain the story. And so anyway, when these three guys don't bow down to the statue, it says Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and he summons the three men, and he's standing before these three men, and he says to them, okay, guys, maybe you're new in town and you don't know how it works around here. But how it works around here is when I say something, people do it. And when I say bow down to me, you need to bow down to me. So you know what? Because you're new, I'm going to give you another shot at this. And we're going to play the music again. We're going to do the whole thing again. And we're going to play the music and the horn and the harp and the lyre. And then when you bow down, if you'll bow down, it's all good. But if you don't bow down, then what we're going to do is we're going to heat a furnace up 7 times hotter, and we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. So that's Nebuchadnezzar's threat. And we're going to pick the story up, Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to pick it all up in verse 16 and see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to say. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." How many think that's a nice, bold-faced statement? I mean, does it get any better than that? These guys totally understood what faith was. Not only did they know that God was able to deliver them, but they knew God was willing to do it. And see, that's the absolute definition of faith, is not only knowing God is able to do something, that God will. John told us in his epistle, he said, if we ask anything according to his will, we know we have the petitions that we ask because he hears us. And so that's the definition of faith, this bold and incredible declaration that our God will deliver us from your hand. The next verse, however, becomes extremely problematic. And let me show you why. Let's read it. The very next verse says this: "But if not, let it be known, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." And here's why it's problematic. Many of the commentators, and you can go check this out for yourself, they say that when they said, "but if not," means that if God doesn't deliver us. So I want you to think about that. Do you see how that's a problem? If this was a faith statement that our God is able and our God will, and then the very next thing out of your mouth is, "but if not," and you're saying, "our God is willing." On the other hand, he might not. You never know. Then it negates the faith statement. Are you following this? Secondly, it makes no sense whatsoever. If God doesn't deliver them from the fiery furnace, then they've become crispy critters. How do they bow down and worship anything? It is a nonsensical answer. A lot like Yogi Berra. Do you remember Yogi Berra? The baseball player, not the bear from Jellystone Park. There's a big difference. And everything he said was always convoluted. And he used to say this. He used to say, if you don't go to other people's funerals, they won't come to yours. That doesn't make sense, just like this doesn't make sense if what they're referring to is the fact that God's not going to deliver them. So what you need to do is you need to read those two statements together. They are both in reference to the threat that they're going to be thrown into the furnace. So the first one is, if that is the case, our God is able to deliver us, and he will. But if not, if that is not the case, if you don't throw us in the fire, we're still not bowing down and worshiping your gods. Doesn't that make sense? Of course that makes sense. I'm winning here, people. You get this, right? This totally makes sense. So there's this great, bold statement. Then what happens is this absolutely infuriates the king. So he does what he threatened to do, and he heats the furnace 7 times hotter. Then he takes these 3 young men and he binds them up, and he has his mightiest and his greatest guards, and they take them to the edge of the fire to throw them into the fiery furnace. Who remembers what happens? They were consumed. The guards were consumed by the heat just getting near, but I guess they succeeded in pushing them into the furnace at the last moment before they died and fell by the wayside. So then these guys fall into the furnace, and what happens next is incredible. And we have to jump down a few verses to see it. It's in verse 24. And it says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke and said to the counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?' And they answered to the king and said, 'True, O king.' Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and here it is, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th one is like the Son of God. I want you to think about this. Jesus said that you will go through the fire, and he says you will go through the deep, and I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. They ended up in the bottom of the fiery pit, and who was there to meet them but Jesus? And for some reason, and don't ask me how, some reason Nebuchadnezzar knew that that was the Son of God. Isn't that sort of interesting? He said the 4th one looks like the Son of God. And so Jesus shows up, and he's walking around, and they're unhurt, and they're unharmed. And so he calls them out, and they come out of the furnace. Interesting, only 3 come out of the furnace. And he's totally impressed with their faith, and he's totally impressed with what happened and this miracle. And so we're just going to jump down to verse 27, and this is what it says. And the satraps, the administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose body the fire had no power. The hair on their head was not singed, nor was their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. How many remember the days that you couldn't come out of a restaurant without smelling like smoke? Right? Do you remember those days? The whole smoking section? I never understood that. Having a smoking section in a restaurant's like having a peeing section in a swimming pool. All you guys that want to pee, you go over onto that end. When us on this end, we want to stay clean. I mean, you got one table between you and the smoking section. It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. But here's my conclusion of this story. Because the whole realm bowed down and worshiped this, except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I consider this the story of 3 young men who resisted peer pressure and refused to smoke. Thank you for getting that. So here's what I want to do. I want to draw some conclusions from this story, and I'm going to give you 3 things today, and I'm going to throw them up on the screen. The first one is this, is that you will never go wrong doing what is right. The second one is Jesus will never be late, but don't expect him to be early. And the third one, you will never be let down if you don't give up. I'm wondering if you notice those are all opposites, right? You can't go wrong doing what is right. You saw that, don't you? You don't think it's that clever. Okay. All right. That's okay. I thought it was pretty darn clever. Anyway, let's talk about this for a moment. You can never go wrong doing what is right. These 3 young men did what was right. They resisted an incredible amount of peer pressure. And they stood up against the whole cultural ethos of the day. And here's what I want to tell you. Each and every one of us are confronted, not every day, but often through our lives, we will be confronted with situations where we will have to bow down to a cultural ethos or a value or actually ask to do something wrong. And what happens is we kind of go with the flow because that's the kind of people we are. We are wired to follow along and to conform and to be uniform with everybody else. You know, it was Peter Marshall, the chaplain to the U.S. Senate, who once said this, if you will stand for nothing, you will fall for anything. And I think that is true. And there's even been research done on this. This is a fascinating story. It was a psychologist by the name of Dr. Ruth Berenda. And what she did was she gathered 10 teenagers in a room, and she put 2 lines on a chalkboard or a whiteboard. One was clearly a longer line than the other line. Now, what she had done is she had taken 9 of these teenagers, and she told them ahead of time to point at the short line when they were asked which was the longest line. And then they would bring in that 10th teenager, and they brought in one after another to see what they would do. And do you know that 75% of those teenagers pointed at the shorter line, even though they knew better, because the rest of the people in the room were doing the same? And see, that's what we do. And we'd love to think that we're individuals, and we'd like to think we make up our own decisions in life. But what happens is we get caught in a cultural flow, and there will be times in our life where you have to make a decision to stand up and do the right thing, and you can never go wrong doing the right thing. Let me illustrate this with a story from our contemporary culture. How many of you would recognize the name Ed Snowden? Ed Snowden, the whistleblower, you got this? He worked for the CIA, he worked for the NSA. He was a computer program developer. And in fact, what he did when he worked for the CIA and then eventually the NSA, National Security Agency, is he had developed software that allowed the US government to spy electronically on emails and on web pages and on phone lines and all of these things. And so he developed this, assuming they were using it to spy on the enemies of the United States. Turns out that they were using this technology to spy on the citizens of the United States. And all 300 million citizens of the US, men, women, and children, were having their records tapped and their emails recorded. And this was going on a massive scale. It was not only illegal, but it was unconstitutional. And it was done both by Republican and Democratic governments. So don't think it's some sort of partisan thing. It wasn't. It was an illegal operation that was known to the very highest realms of the President of the United States. And so there Ed Snowden was. He was just a young man. He was in his 20s. He's now working at an NSA base in Hawaii. He's going over this, and he's realizing what they're doing with the information, and he knew it was wrong. And he was no longer willing to be part of it, and he was no longer willing to let his software to be used in this way. So he got on a plane. He went from Hawaii to Hong Kong, and he spilled the beans to the press. And he became this, famous whistleblower. And then what he did, the moment he did that, he jumped on a plane from Hong Kong to Moscow en route to South America. But what happened is his passport got pulled while he was en route to Moscow, and therefore he couldn't leave Moscow, and that was 2013, and he is still there to this day. He's trapped. He's a fugitive. If he comes back to the United States, he's going to be tried for treason, and he's probably at least going to go to jail. He could actually be executed as a treasonist in his land. And so that's what's going on with this young man. He was 29 years old when he made this decision. And he realized he could no longer be party to what was wrong and what was clearly illegal. And I know some of you are thinking, you go, well, wait a minute, Pastor Mark. Didn't he break the law by taking that information from his computer and leaking it to the press? Wasn't that breaking the law? And you'd be absolutely correct. And I would say, didn't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego break the law when they would not bow down to this image? Did not Daniel break the law a few chapters later when he was told not to pray to his God, and he did anyway, and he got thrown into the lion's den? Did not the disciples, when they were preaching the gospel in Jerusalem and told not to preach the gospel in Jesus' name, and they continued to do so, and they were arrested, and they were persecuted, and they were even beheaded, were they not breaking the law? Are not the Bible translators that you support in the country of Nepal are breaking the law every single day when they go to work? And you are supporting them financially. You are guilty by association. You're all going straight to hell. Now, I'm not arguing that you should break the law. And I'm not even going to argue the fact that whether you think it was right or wrong that Ed Snowden broke the law in order to do this. He couldn't think of another way to deal with it. And he knew he wasn't going to be able to stop it. Here's what I do admire about the man. Let's just leave the illegal part of it aside for a moment. He decided that he was willing to do the right thing no matter what it cost him. He had a $200,000 a year job in Hawaii. And now he's going to spend the rest of his life living in Moscow. He paid a big price. He said, I would rather be without a state than without a voice. He put it all on the line to do what is right. I want to tell you a story about my own foray into politics. Some of you maybe even don't even know, you haven't been around long enough to know that I was at one time a politician. And I ran in the 1993 federal election for Member of Parliament in Winnipeg South. And I made a decision when I went into politics because I knew the world of politics, and I knew what it was like, and I knew how people get caught up in this current. And I made a decision that I was always going to tell the truth. I was going to tell the audience, whoever they were, the truth, whether they liked it or not, and I was going to say the same thing wherever I was. And I wasn't going to alter my message for my crowd. And I just decided I was going to try to maintain my integrity in this world of politics. My opponent, on the other hand, and I'm not going to mention his name, but you wouldn't have a hard time figuring it out if you wanted to. He was, let me put it this way, given to duplicity is what he was. Let me put it this way. When we were at the University of Manitoba debating, he was pro-choice. When we were at the Catholic school, he was pro-life. And everywhere he went, he had a different message. It was absolutely quite profound. Here's a little quiz for you. You know how you can tell when a politician is lying? Yeah, his lips are moving. And that is the world of politics. And there's a reason, because people want to hear what they want to hear. And so politicians tell them what they want to hear. I decided I was going to tell the truth whether they liked it or not. Guess what? They didn't like it. And some of you are looking at me and say, Pastor Mark, didn't you lose? Yeah, you would actually be right. I did lose, but only the election. See, I didn't really lose. See, I didn't win the election, but I didn't lose. You only lose when you give up your integrity. Because when you give up your integrity and your honesty and you give up on who you are, then you've lost. And I didn't give that up. So I emerged from it. Guess what? I can sleep at night. And I emerged from that without regrets. And I don't have to look back at it and go, I wished I'd done this, I wished I'd done that. I lost the election, but I maintained my character and I maintained my integrity. And that's worth more than anything in this world. There's a little addendum to this story, because this particular politician, he went on to become quite an eminent politician. He was a cabinet minister in Chrétien's government, also one in Paul Martin's government. And the thing was, we had spent so many days together, a month and a half, debating every day together, and we actually ended up becoming friends. And even though I didn't agree with him on a lot of political stuff, I liked him as a person. We would go out for lunch together, and we actually became friends. And so when we bought our first building, I invited him to the grand opening of our building, and I invited him to speak. And he got up, brought greetings, and he was very gracious that day. And then he went and sat over to my right here in the front seat, and he had never heard me preach. He'd heard me debate, but he'd never heard me preach. And he'd never seen me on television, never been to the church, and he sat there, and he was quite gobstruck by the whole thing. And then he came right up to me as soon as I finished preaching, and he grabbed my hand, and he shook my hand, and he said, Mark, that was a hell of a good speech. I'm just quoting it word for word. And I said, well, those aren't probably the words I would have used, but thank you so much. And then he said this, and I'll never forget it. And then he said this. He said, you know, Mark, when I see you doing what you're doing now, I can't help but think that it was the right thing for you to lose that election and me to win. You know what? I couldn't argue with him, because I think it was true. I think what happens is all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. Do you agree with that? That's what the scripture says. You can never go wrong by doing what's right. You want to know something? We almost always know what the right thing to do is. We almost always do. We're just not sure we're willing to do it. There's a story of Mark Twain, and he says when he was 14 years old, he went and he stole a melon off a street vendor's cart. And he went into the back lane, and he took a bite of the melon. He says, as soon as I bit into the melon, a strange feeling came over me, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. So I returned the melon to the cart, and I got a ripe one. So the first thing is this, you can never go wrong doing what is right. The second thing is this, that Jesus will never be late, but don't ever expect him to be early. How many of you have noticed that? This story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I don't know. I think that the fact that they ended up in the bottom of the furnace before Jesus showed up, maybe that's not late, but it's late-ish. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, when they were making that big statement that their God was going to be able to deliver them, weren't you thinking, maybe any moment, Lord, show up? Then they're bound and they're getting taken to the edge of it. They're going, now, Lord, now would be a good time. And then the guards beside them are dying from the heat. I'm thinking, really good time. And then you get thrown in and you're falling to the bottom of the pit and you're thinking, any microsecond now, Lord, would be good. You know, you have to be like the optimist who fell off the 10-story building, and as he passed the 5th floor, he said, so far, so good. And they ended up in the very bottom of the pit before Jesus finally showed up. And as you look through Scripture, you find that same M.O. again and again and again. Remember Lazarus, the story we all know? He heard that Lazarus was sick long before he was dead. And when he got there, what was the scenario? He had been dead for 4 days. And Mary and Martha were mad, and they said, had you been here, our brother wouldn't have died. That's absolutely true. And then the story of Jairus' daughter. And when Jesus heard the message, she was merely sick. By the time he got to the house, she was dead. And when you look at these stories, he raised the dead in both those cases. How many of you think that raising someone from the dead is a greater miracle than healing someone who's sick? It's a greater miracle. It was greater for the glory of God. Now, you don't want to be the person who's dead and waiting, hoping he's going to show up. That seems late-ish to me. I don't know. 4 days? It seemed late. I don't know. But we have to know that he'll show up in his time. And here's what I want you to understand. Don't miss this. If Jesus showed up when you wanted him to, you would never grow in your faith. Don't you think that's true? Because you would never have a chance to hang out there a bit. And he says, though you go through the waters and though you go through the fire, I will be with you. And what happens is when we go through those situations is when our faith actually grows. And here's a thought, too, I want you to think about. If Jesus is always there and always with you, how can he actually be late? He's already there. And so it's really a matter of us beginning to understand that he's already there. We just need to wait for him to make himself known, if I can put it that way. Do you remember that story in Mark chapter 4 where Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee? He did not say, let's paddle out to the middle and sink and go to the bottom and drown and die. He did not say that. He said, let us cross over to the other side. So they get in the boat. And they start rowing, and by the time they get into the middle of the sea, a huge storm comes up, even to the point where the waves were coming right over into the boat. And who remembers where Jesus was? It says he was asleep on a pillow. Now, here's my question for you. How do you sleep on a pillow when the waves are coming into the boat? I mean, the pillow's going to be all wet. Do you think you could sleep on a wet pillow? But Jesus can sleep. He's not guilty like the rest of you that can't sleep. You know, he's living right. And so he's asleep on this pillow. And then, of course, the disciples go over and they wake him up. They say, Lord, Lord, wake up. Do you not care that we are perishing? They've got a lot of faith, don't they? So he rubs his eyes and he goes, oh, yeah, it's nasty out. Peace, be still. And the winds and the waves go still. And then what did Jesus do after that? Who remembers? He rebuked them. And he says, why were you so fearful? How come you have so little faith? Why was he mad at them? Why did he think they had no faith? Because they didn't recognize the fact that he was with them the whole time. They're not going to the bottom. Jesus is already there. He can't be late. He's already arrived. Right? You following this? How many of you have been on one of those boats on the Sea of Galilee? Any of you been to the Sea of Galilee? It's a great thing. You can go on those boats and they'll show you. I got some pictures that they'll show you. We were on this boat and the guide shows you how to throw the net into the Sea of Galilee. And if you look at that picture, you say, where's Mark? Where is Mark in this picture? Well, here it is. I was asleep in the bow of the boat. I got into that boat and I couldn't find a pillow, but I fell fast asleep. And I thought, I am so much like Jesus, it's unbelievable. And when I realized I was just like Jesus, when we got out of the boat, I tried to walk on water, and here's my first couple of steps. I was doing super good because I was on this log underneath the water. The next step was a doozy, and I was up to my knees in the water. It's all muddy. It's not that clean, really, the Sea of Galilee. And you know what? We just need to recognize the fact that Jesus can't be late because he's already there. I want to tell you this little story. A few years ago, I decided I was going to get my scuba certification, and we were down on holidays in Florida, and so we had done all the training that you had to do, the classroom training, and then you do pool training, and then we did some work in the canals, and then to graduate, you have to do 2 open sea or open water dives, and so that meant going out into the Gulf of Mexico where we were. The problem was there had been this huge north wind that had come up. It was blowing for days. We only had the 1 week, and so by the final day, the instructor said, we're going out to do the open water dives, even though it's a terrible day. And we have no choice because people were going home from their holidays and whatnot. And so we get into this boat, we go into the Gulf of Mexico, and the wind is blowing from the north, from Canada, by the way, and it's cold. The waves are coming over the boat. Everybody is soaked and freezing, and the waves were 6 feet tall. And we banged out for 10 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. By the time we got to our destination, almost everybody on the boat was seasick and hanging over the rail, ralphing into the sea. And so we get there, and the reason he persisted in taking us out there was he wasn't planning on refunding us our money. And see, he was going come hell or high water. You're following this, right? So he gets us out there. By the time it's time to go for our dive, they've got the anchor set. Only 2 of us are capable of going because the rest are all sick. And so he takes the 2 of us, and so we suit up, and we got our mask and flippers and tanks on, a regulator, and we jump in. And I mean, these waves are just coming over our heads. So the first thing we did was we swam to the bow of the boat, and there's the anchor line that's going down, and our plan was we were going to follow the anchor line down to the bottom and then go search the reef down there. But what happened was the other person with me, other than the instructor, was a 25-year-old gal. And by the time she got around to the bow of the boat with those huge 6-foot waves coming over our head, she completely freaked out. And she had a massive panic attack. And so he has to take her back to the stern of the boat and get her on. So he says to me, this is what he says. He says, Mark, you stay here. He says, hold on to the anchor line. Don't let go. And whatever you do, don't descend without me. So he's given me very specific instructions. So in 1 second, he's gone because the waves just took them and they were gone to the back of the boat. And so I grab a hold of the anchor line. Now, what do you think a boat is doing in 6-foot waves? What do you suppose the bow of the boat is doing in 6-foot waves? It was coming 10 and 12 feet out of the water. I'm holding on to the anchor line. And so every time that boat goes up, I get launched out of the water like this. I'm not joking. It was launching me into the air with my tanks and my fins on. I was in the air and then slamming me back onto the water and then launching me out and down. And I'm there, and he said, whatever you do, don't let go of the rope. Now, the reason is if I let go of the rope, then what happens is the waves are going to take me out to sea. So I have to hold on to the stupid rope. And he told me, he forbade me from going down under by myself because I'm not certified to do it. And so I'm holding onto this rope. I'm getting just hammered into the air, back down again. It was the least fun I've ever spent money to do, ever. And so I'm thinking, okay, he'll be gone a minute and then he'll be back. A minute goes by, he's not back. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. 5 minutes, he's still not back. I'm still being launched into the air. Now, I wasn't afraid of dying because I thought at the very least of things, I can go under the boat, swim under the boat, come up on the other side, and I'm going to be okay. But he told me to stay here. And so I waited. And he was gone because the gal was having this profound panic attack. He was gone for 10 minutes. And by the time he got there, I'm completely exhausted. He comes around and says, so are you ready? You notice how when people are going through a rough time, a lot of times we'll say to them this, we'll say, well, just hang in there. I no longer say that to people because I've experienced just hang on there, just hang in there, and it's not pretty. It's not fun, and no one should ever just have to hang in there. But I hung in there, and guess what? He finally showed up, we descended, and guess what? Peace, be still. There's no waves at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. You know that the fish don't even know when it's windy out? And it was this peaceful, calm, glorious day, and I got certified. I was the only one that day who got through it because I hung in there. So first, you need to remember this, that you can never go wrong by doing what is right. Number 2, that Jesus is never late, but don't ever expect him to be early. And the last and the final thing is this, and it sort of goes with what I just said, is that you will never be let down if you don't give up. You know what? Here's the thing, people. Every single one of us will face the fires. Every single one of us will go through the waters. Every one of you will have challenges in your life, and you need to remember that he is always there. Just call on his name, and he'll be there. I want to close with one final story, and it's probably the most painful story that I've ever told you. A personal story about a time where Kathy and I went through a fire that no one should ever have to go through. And when we had our first child, our son Jordan, he was this really healthy young boy, I'll call him that. By the time he was 6 months old, he weighed 26 pounds. People didn't call him Jordan, they called him Jumbo. He was so chubby and fat and rolls of fat. By the time he was a year, he was 36 pounds. And, he had these ripples of fat going down his arms and his chest. We used to dress him up in a Speedo and take him to the beach, and he'd walk down like a little bodybuilder. He looked like a miniature Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And he had no hair. He was bald, too. And so he just walked down the beach with these little ripply rolls of fat. And we would take pictures of him, point and laugh and stuff. And so we really were enjoying our first child. And you love your kids no matter what they look like. You get that. And so this is what happened. When he was about 15 months old, he got sick, and he was vomiting and sick. And so, we put him to bed and did what you do as parents, and you try to comfort him and care for him. And after a couple of days, he wasn't any better. So we took him to the doctor, and the doctor says, he just has a little flu. Give it a couple of days, and it'll be gone. So a couple of days later, it wasn't gone. So we went back to the doctor. And the doctor says, well, there might be a little ear infection there. I'll give you some amoxicillin, banana-flavored, kids like that. And so we went home. We started administering that. Now, we couldn't get this kid to eat. We could see he was sick. He was barely waking up. There was something significantly wrong, so we were giving him the medication, hoping that was going to help. He hadn't eaten anything from the very beginning of this. We had been forcing him to drink, and never really came out of his crib that entire time. And then so after a few more days, we thought, we got to go to a different doctor. This kid's just not getting any better. And so we went to a third appointment to a different doctor. And this doctor took one look at him and said, you get in your car and you drive to the Children's Hospital, and I'm going to phone ahead. And we said, well, what's going on? He said, just go. Just get in your car, go right now. They'll be waiting for you. So we didn't know what was going on. We got in the car, we drove down there. They started to administer a bunch of tests, x-rays and CAT scan and a spinal tap. And then they came back and they told us, they said, your son has bacterial spinal meningitis, Haemophilus influenza B. There is a vaccine for it today, but there wasn't back then. Plus he has pleural pneumonia and bacteria all around the outside of his lungs, and your son is very, very sick. And we said, well, what's going to happen? They said, well, we're going to try to save his life. But you need to know this, that there's a good chance that your son will be deaf or blind or mentally handicapped if he can get through this. And so I remember looking at that doctor. Imagine this young couple in your 20s. And I remember looking at the doctor and saying, well, what's the good news? And he said, the good news is your son's not dead yet, and we might have a chance to save him. And so we submitted him to the hospital, and there he was, and day after day, it wasn't getting any better. And he had tubes all hooked up to him and IVs and all kinds of things. And day after day, we were there all day long, and he wasn't getting any better. And this went on day after day. At least he was on an IV. And we were praying like we had never prayed before. And this ordeal went on for 21 days. And 21 days, there was no sign of improvement. And in this whole time, we were praying and praying. And one day during our prayer time, I came across a verse in Psalm 91. And it says, and he shall call upon me, and I will answer him in his trouble. And I will deliver him and honor him. And with long life, I will satisfy him, and I will show him the salvation of the Lord. And I knew in that moment that God had given me a promise and a word for my child in that moment. And if I could hang in there and believe that he would do what he said he would do, he said, with long life, I will satisfy him. That's what the scripture said, and show him my salvation. And so we prayed that prayer every day up until the 21st day. And at the 21st day, the fever finally broke. And our son began to mend, and finally they let him out of the hospital on about day 30. Remember, he was 36 pounds when he went in. He came out weighing 16 pounds. He had these skinny little legs and skinny little arms, and he didn't look anything like he had looked his entire life. He could no longer walk. He could no longer talk. He was intimidated by crowds and other people and wanted to be held all the time. And we thought, what are we going to do? And we thought, you know what? We're not going to coddle this child. We're going to let this child face life and face the world, and we're going to teach him how to walk, and we're going to teach him how to talk, and we're going to make him face crowds, and we're going to bring him to church, and we're going to make him interact with other babies, and we're going to believe God's going to totally restore him. At this point, we didn't know what damage was done to him. Well, we just plugged away at that. And those of you that know my son today will know that he's 6'3", 225 pounds. He's a computer engineer doing his MBA at the moment. And ladies, he's single. I'm not one for quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, but I will this time. Anything that won't kill you will ultimately make you stronger. We need to realize that Jesus will always be there. Greater is he who is in you than he that is in the world. And if God be for you, who can be against? Let's stand together, shall we?